So welcome guys to this presentation on a tricky subject. I was at a conference probably a month ago roughly in St. John's, Newfoundland. This conference was given by, I forget his name, but he's kind of well known in a certain milieu in Canada. And he was giving a conference somewhat, right, on random selection in politics, but he was giving it from a perspective of participation and democracy, let's say. And after the conference, I was talking to a professor there who did not know me, and I didn't really know him, although I've seen his name before once. But he was a physics professor, and he wanted to ask the presenter a question, right? What he didn't know is that, and he told me, I was talking with him and he kind of wanted to go to talk to that other guy who gave the conference, and he kind of missed him. And I asked him, well, what was the question you wanted to ask? And so this presentation is kind of dedicated to him because it's an attempt to answer his question in a orderly manner, right? We had a quick conversation, him and myself, and he missed the other guy. But what he didn't know was that the person he was talking to might have had as many or perhaps more ideas than the presenter himself, right? I'm also a specialist in that field, and so I might have enough background, let's say, to answer that question, or at least to give it a try, right? It would be interesting to ask other people, although, about this question also, and maybe this presentation could be a sort of first take on such a project, because it's always interesting when you're dealing with new ideas. Like random selection in politics is not exactly new, but it's a novelty for most people still nowadays. To first of all talk to people that don't know much about the subject and ask them a few questions. And this is the case where Mr. Tarasov is not, he's a physics professor, right? So he's not specialized in this field, but often people that are outside of a field have very good ideas about, how could I say, they kind of, their input feeds reflection on a certain thinking on a certain subject. So this is one of these cases where the question that he wanted to ask was something I kind of, that was in the back of my mind that I kind of dealt with, like thought about, let's say, frequently, but never really came up with much upon it, in the sense, like, consider my thought on that subject unfinished, right? Kind of like unfinished business. There's stuff I want to do in that field. In my case, I can give you a little bit of a background so you kind of understand where I'm coming from. When I'm talking about my specialty, or one of them, like this is one of the things I work upon, is a random selection in politics. And what I mean by that is the use of random selection as in a permanent assembly, like a prospective permanent assembly. So something in the future. There's, although all those experiments that are kind of going forward nowadays, my thought is a little bit more like, how could we use that in a really permanent setting with a in a situation where those institutions using random selection would have an impact, right? So I conceived, for example, of a novel state structure where there'd be actually several randomly picked assemblies to deal with constitutional issues, for one, right? With more day-to-day legal issues, or like legislature or legislative issues. So basically, they kind of like keep a check on elected parliament. And you could also have random selection actually to select judges. That's a little bit more of it requires a bit more of well, all of them require a lot more detail, but I'm just kind of giving you a very quick take on kind of what I usually work on. That I would define that as kind of my field, right? But in the process of thinking about this stuff, obviously you sometimes think about like parallel stuff. For example, the question that Mr. Tarasov had is how, he had kind of two, right? But how could we use a random selection on the international level? He's actually a physicist, but if I recall properly, he works on climate change. So he's actually, well, obviously concerned rather by that issue and by the fact that our political systems aren't apparently capable of dealing with that properly, in the sense that we have political systems, we have an issue on the planetary level that's unresolved, that's serious, that will have very serious consequences in the near future, starting like, I mean, it has already had, but it's going to just get worse and worse if we don't do much about it. And more and more people are realizing, well, there must be a problem on how our states, our governments are organized, right? And he was thinking straight up on the world level, which is, challenging. My thought, as I kind of specified, is more on the state level. So state could be federal or provincial or a state in the American type, or like other federations have two levels. So it could be on either level, and that's where I'm more comfortable. So there's also, as I said, like subjects on the international level, like Tarasov was interested in, and furthermore, there'd be subjects or let's say parallel opportunities for using random selection, let's say on the municipal level, right? Which I thought about sufficiently to have something to say about it, although it's not the subject of this presentation here. But it's just to say that, like, it's not an idea that's limited to one topic. It could also be used in a university, for example. And since we're having a lot of trouble in our university at the moment, in the university system, you could even say in Newfoundland, it would be a very opportune undertaking to have a much more thorough thought process or reflection on how random selection could be used within a university setting, to have an independent university that's not dependent on government, and to have also policies within that university that are well anchored with the needs and the will of the people, right? And so that's another example of how it could be used. You might have guessed that I'm kind of slightly attached to that other example, and I might maybe do a presentation in the future about that subject. And so, but this one is an attempt. It's a kind of a challenge for me, actually, because I honestly wouldn't have had the ideas that I want to present here if I hadn't had that conversation, that very quick conversation with Mr. Lev Tarasov. And so, as I said, he had kind of two ideas. There's one that I'm not really comfortable of dealing with now, because it's a complicated idea, and I think it might be a little bit too far ahead. Although there's also a part of me that wants to like challenge myself to deal with such a subject. But I think that this presentation at least will give us an idea of perhaps how, kind of like give us a first attempt at an answer to that larger question. The other topic that came to mind that was a concern of Mr. Tarasov, and probably not just him, was that he mentioned, if I'm, well, if my memory's correct, because it was a month ago, but he mentioned, I think, the Israeli or Palestinian conflict that's kind of raging at the moment. And he might have mentioned the Ukrainian and Russian conflict also, or maybe I'm the one who pitched back that it could also maybe be used in Russia. I forget exactly who, but if my memory is correct, he's the one that mentioned that maybe something could be done regarding like the not just the climate issue, but the peace issue in the Middle East, right? And that kind of sparked something in my mind, and so this presentation is really on that specific topic, right? So what I'd like to do first is that I did a class actually that I put on YouTube. It was a number of years ago, but it's in French, right? And so it's like a 35-hour class presenting basically my ideas up to then, right, on this subject. But it happens to be in a language that not everybody speaks, and so this is kind of an attempt to redo something similar with the English language here, or in the English language. So the idea I'd like to develop here is how could we possibly use random selection in an attempt to address, let's say, the conflict that's raging between the Palestinians and Israel at the moment, right? And that's been there for quite a while, and that probably won't be resolved if, I mean, hopefully it will, but doesn't look like there's much of a the opportunities for hope might seem a little bit dim, right? Depends how you look at things, but like it's, things aren't very don't seem, I suppose, for most people, or at least for me, don't seem very optimistic for the near future, right? And obviously, when there's a situation of tension and there's events that precipitate a war or an armed conflict of some sort, right? Well, not just some sort. Positions on both sides become immediately very polarized, right? And that's when you need kind of an arbitrator or a peacemaker to maybe try to formulate a plan and that can lead us somewhere, right? So that was kind of the general idea that came out of that quick conversation. And what I'd like to do here, as I said, is explain how random selection could be used. Now, what I want to insist upon is that random selection is kind of a new tool in politics, in the sense that there's many things that still can be, let's say, tried that haven't been tried, or there's kind of variants that are important. So that's one of the things I want to talk here, is how basically what are the issues in conceptualizing institutions or ad hoc bodies to using random selection, and what are the options that we have, and how useful can this be in various ways. So I don't actually have one idea. That's what I'm kind of trying to say. I have a series of ideas that I can present you, and maybe looking at that series, you or I might find that, this one seems pretty much something we could do, right? So if you find that, if you Mr. Tarasov, for example, thinks that what I'm saying isn't too stupid, maybe he can forward it to somebody else and ask them what they think about it, and maybe something could come out of that conversation. Myself, I'm not a very good organizer for social movements, but if there's a sort of movement towards something, I could maybe contribute like a little bit more also than what's going to be said here. But I'd like to give an idea of that first spark, right? What I'm saying is basically, if you find this presentation interesting, forward it to somebody, or make it known, so other people can maybe jump in the bandwagon and do something about it if they think that these ideas are pertinent, right? And keep me in touch. I'd like to know. It'd be fun to know if possible. So the first thing to understand is that these types of institutions, I'll use the word institution here referring to a permanent institution, although in this case, at first, I'd be referring to an ad hoc institution. So a body that is there for a moment of time, and that might not be there in the near future. It might last for 3 months, 6 months, a year, or 2 years. In this case, it might be actually a sort of open question, right? But it could be also for a set amount of time, right? And so I might use the word institution referring to an ad hoc institution, even though I might not always repeat the word ad hoc. So the first thing to say, or one of the first things to say, is that these types of experiences have been used in the last 40, 50 years, and in the very distant past in Athens. And we have some knowledge about those experiences, obviously those experiments or those institutions, because there's places in Europe nowadays, if I didn't follow up on that because I'm a bit rusty in the field, but where seemingly random selection is used on a more permanent basis, like in Belgium and Ireland and stuff. But what I want to say is that and so we have those experiences, and most of them involve the government. Let's say most clearly do, right? Some were purely academic experiences, or involve a different level of government. Some were really experiments run by academics to see how it would work, right? But even the government experiments. They're not always necessarily run by the government, but sometimes kind of supported by the government, right? They are obviously analyzed also by political scientists and other people that can compare and fine-tune these kind of experiments or institutions. However, there is an area within that that span of possibilities, right? That are a number of areas actually that are maybe underexploited. And since I'm more on the novelty side of things, this is what I want to kind of explain and discuss here. For example, you could have a number of NGOs grouping together as a coalition, right? And pooling money together to create such assemblies for various topics in a society, right? And obviously, these ad hoc institutions wouldn't have exactly the same impact as an institution that's kind of backed by government, right? But they would have another advantage that is significant and that has to be taken into consideration, is that not being backed by government, they wouldn't have all the drawbacks that come from that, right? Because if it's backed by government, it's basically going to be controlled up to a certain point by the government. I don't want to get into the detail of how deep or light that control might be, but there's always a kind of big brother besides that's kind of using the randomly picked assembly or body to or kind of funding, organizing, putting conditions, determining how far it can go, and kind of pushing it in a certain way or giving it a span of action that's sometimes too limited, for example, or putting conditions that aren't necessarily democratic, etc., etc. Right? I'm not saying it's always the case, but or using them for consultation purposes when they could be used for decision purposes. Right? So there could be a potential conflict if a randomly picked body would have an opinion that's quite different from a government-funded body. Right? And so you can probably quickly understand that if it's funded by NGOs, it wouldn't have, if there's it could deal with situations where such a potential conflict could arise between those two opinions. That's what I'm more interested in myself, because if I want to reform this state, it's because it's not functioning well, right? And so I'm looking at corrections within the state using this tool, not just as a sort of adjunct to a system that's not working well. Although those experiments do have their value, like it's not my perspective on the ideal or prospective use of these mechanisms. So it's kind of like there's those two sides, right? They kind of form a whole, but I'm more on the side of how could we like basically enact more radical change or changes through random selection in politics. Now, there's also another mechanism that's the most opportune one in my sense, or from my perspective, right? Which is that instead of even using an NGO, or perhaps in collaboration with a few NGOs or unions or other associations or movements, we could also crowdfund a randomly selected body, and therefore create a sort of, well, different things, but one of the things we could create is a sort of shadow assembly, like a citizens' assembly that would look, for example, at what government does and say, we as citizens, as randomly picked citizens who are a sample of the population, and therefore that are more legitimate than elected officials, in the sense that they represent the population better than like people that have been elected even, right? Although some people would argue that, that's my position, right? And I think it's the right one, that it's that's on the mark. And therefore, like if we crowdfunded, for example, an assembly of people that would look at what government's doing and say, this we don't agree, this we don't agree, this we don't agree, this we don't agree. What it would do is that people within society would look at that and say, actually, maybe random selection would be a better option, or a complementary option, which is my position, my personal one, right? But they can have their own ideas also. But maybe they might realize that random selection is more useful than elections to select people to govern. That might be a surprising take, right? and one that might be a little bit displeasing to elected politicians, some of them at least. But if they're wise, maybe not all of them, right? But if but you can see that, like, if we crowdfunded an assembly like that and had it debate and take positions on what the other assembly, the elected one, is debating, there would be a distinction between what that first assembly, ours, would say and what their assembly is saying, to put it that way, right? I'm using ours and they in a sort of slightly confrontational, not exactly, but like I'm kind of distinguishing the two things to show on whose side I really am, right? I'm not a big fan of our present political systems because I know them, right? Because I know them kind of in depth, because I have another perspective through this science on how dysfunctional they are and how especially functional they could be if we use this novel tool, which is random selection. But right, that would require, well, there's people to actually pick up this idea, crowdfund it, and do it, right, for one. But there's another, let's say, more immediate, as I said, problem that we have is that we have people slaughtering themselves. I'm sorry for that word, but really killing themselves on both sides, a lot of suffering, people migrating, a lot of international debate about the issue in the Gaza Strip, right, in particular. And so maybe, right, following Mr. Tarasov's lead, we could think about how random selection could be used in that conflict, as I said, right? And so in this case, what I would recommend is a crowd-funded assembly. I mean, there's other options, as I just explained, but I would recommend a crowdfunding assembly that would look at that conflict and give its opinion on the situation, and maybe try to we'll get to that. What would it do, or what its mandate would be? Could be an open mandate of some sort, but it could try to craft a peace plan. It could try to determine other things depending on other variants. We'll see down later when I'm going to get to those points. But my first point is, like, who funds it basically determines kind of what it's going to do, but also its independence, right? And also it does determine how much formal power it does have. Now, this is kind of important because obviously, if it's backed by government will give it some power, but it's going to be controlled and limited. If it's crowdfunded, to give that other out example, right, it's not going to have a formal power, but it might have enough influence to make the other people think about it twice. You might also have situations where there's kind of an alignment between the two. And here I'll give you an example of what that means, right? Let's say we did create a crowd-funded assembly like that. And this is, let's say, option one in Canada, right? To determine the Canadian policy on that particular issue, right? It might be a big, how would you say, soulagement. I forget how to say that word in English. It might be a big release of some sort, right? Emotional release for politicians, because that's a subject that they don't really want to deal with that much, right? They're gonna stumble. They're kind of like, there's a war basically, and so they're kind of stuck in the middle, right? And so by giving them an option out, by telling them, if we randomly pick citizens, we put them together and we ask them to craft a Canadian policy on that issue, well, they can kind of wash their hands from that issue, look at what they're going to say, and say, well, after the people spoke, essentially, right, this seems what the Canadian people want to do, and so we'll follow that, right? And I think a lot of politicians on both sides would probably agree that it might be wise to take hands off on that subject and to have a debate, but to use this mechanism as a way to sort of, you could say, come together on the issue, like, in a sense, or at least, well, basically, a lot of politicians don't want to take responsibility, right? Because it's such an explosive issue, right? Or they well, basically, like, who really wants to go out there and say, I side with this side and that side when the other side is going to do something bad about it, right? Or might do, right? You understand basically the issue, I suppose. But in some cases like that, even though it would be crowdfunded, I wouldn't be surprised if some politicians sort of aligned with the issue, because with the project, because of the particular situation itself, right? There's hot issues, in other words, with which politicians aren't exactly in a good spot actually just to deal with, because they're stuck in all the machinery thing, right? And so this would kind of give them a way out, right? I'm sort of like, as you might have noticed, I'm not very I'm very French, in the sense I am not very keen on our elected representatives. But in some cases, they're also, not in some cases, but I'm going to rephrase that, they're also human beings, and in some cases, instead of saying that in some cases they're human beings, which might be a question to ask, but in some cases, these other human beings um, might have, situations where we can actually talk, and where they might find that the best idea is not necessarily the ones that they decide. It's maybe letting other people decide what's the best for the country, in this case, for example, right? And why is that? Because this issue is explosive, because there's very strong interest groups behind each. And what this means politically is that this mechanism could quickly be kind of become a way to legitimize a position that the politicians might want to do, but that on another hand, they're gonna, it might be a kind of a way to reinforce the good within the political leaders that we have, right? I'm sorry, like if you're an elected representative, I'm really not on your side, right? So I'm pretty clear. I'm pretty sure that's like very clear. It doesn't mean I'm necessarily such a mean person, hopefully, but I tend to think that maybe 5% of our elected representatives are good people, right? For the rest, I pretty much scrap them all and start over if I could, right? That's kind of my French perspective on stuff, you could say. I've heard that idea though from another person that wasn't French, but and I realized, well, I'm not the only one that had that type of idea, right? Now, this said, you have to also be reasonable and understand that some people are well intentioned, even though they're in situations that are, with a lot of pressures on them. But as a specialist of political systems, like, this system is just dysfunctional, and one of the effects of that is that the people in the system tend to be the people often that shouldn't be there, right? And tend not to be the good people to run a country or the world or a city or a university, but tend to be people that are aligned with the interests that are really represented in our system, instead of being aligned with the people, right? So for me, there has to be a sort of revolution, and this would be a green revolution of some sorts for some things, but also peaceful revolution, using a mechanism within our political systems to really change society, right? So, not promoting weapons, obviously. I'm not promoting not doing anything, but I'm promoting a sort of permanent change through our structures, through the political structures that we were kind of how would you say in English, that exist, right? That we're under, that under whose control we are now, but which what I would like to change to have more reasonable policies, like on many issues. And so, okay, so that concerns funding and who calls the assembly. Um, Now, there's another set of like technical issues beneath that are also pertinent, right? One of the main issues is that when you call an assembly like that, it's not just gonna, like, they're not just gonna, those citizens are people that are randomly selected, won't just go in a building, talk together, and come out with a magic decision, right? They're going to consult other citizens, talk to their neighbors, talk to their family, talk to maybe have like formal consultations of other citizens. They're also usually going to be fed, and that's a big problem, by, or an issue, fed by so-called specialists. So people will come with different ideas and tell them, we think this, we think that, right? Or groups will come, or people like me will come, or professors will come and tell them, we think this is how that issue should be dealt with, right? Um, and so that's not bad, but the problem is who determines who gets to be one of those speakers, right? And the usual, and that explains how that control aspect, when it's called or organized by a government or supported, backed by government, how that comes into play, right? The problem is that who selects the specialists or the experts or the people that are giving those perspectives, right? They'll usually tend to be diverse, but there might be people that are excluded because maybe their idea is a little bit too far out there, or stuff like that, right? Depending on who selects them, right? And so my take on that is that the best way is actually to give that power to the assembly itself, right? Instead of having the government, maybe sponsor a group that's going to select do those so-called experts, or real experts, hopefully, there's probably a better chance that we're going to get a more democratic experiment if the citizens organize, right, and select perhaps people to do the selecting and supervise those people directly, right? And so one of its first functions should be to determine who's going to feed them, in a sense, those ideas, right? Doesn't mean it's a closed door, and once they said it, it has to be like super rigid. But like basically, you could skew an assembly like that by giving, like, say, to some experts on one side more than the other, for example, right? And so if it's the citizens themselves, they'll kind of have a hopefully an independent take on the issue and want to get that diversity of ideas. There's also another issue about like selecting the presidency. Presidency can be organized in different ways. It can be one person, it could be, let's say, a co-presidency, like a man and a woman, for example. And that decision is often taken by big brother government on the side, like typically, right? What I'm suggesting is that the assembly itself should, assemble, have a temporary president to start with, and select a permanent president based on that, right? And the temporary president obviously couldn't be a candidate, just to avoid the possibility of that becoming a sort of issue. Or they could basically also like assemble and choose a president amongst themselves, right? That would be even better in my opinion. But the point is, they should be given the power to choose and therefore dismiss the president if they so wish, right? Sometimes there's shortcuts that are used that are kind of legitimate for financial reasons, right? Because obviously, if there's a first debate to select the president or the presidency, and there's a second debate to create a committee, let's say, that would draft a proposal about who's going to be admitted as an expert, or like how we're going to organize that consultation part, right? Those take time and they take money, and it becomes like an organizational issue for one, but also financial issue if the money is limited, especially, right? And so it's not just control, there's also finance. And when the government is giving the money, obviously there's kind of like both things that come into play. Now, one important issue also, I'm kind of covering the most essential things here, is that, actually, maybe I could talk about another small issue that often comes to mind, right? Just to cover that issue quickly. Often people will ask, what do you do if people don't want to participate, right? Or if they do want to participate. And so in a permanent assembly, like, my position is that the people should be allowed to desist, and that you'd select somebody with the same demographic characteristics to replace that person, right? That's called rather stratification, right? So basically, we're used to doing random selection in social sciences, and we're just kind of reusing those tools to organize an assembly that we know is going to be representative of the population. And this tool, or not tool, but let's say procedure of stratification, is essentially to say, for example, to give the most simple example, there's going to be half women and half men, right? Because there's roughly half and half in the population. And so if, for example, 20% of the women desist and 10% of the men desist, so they don't really want to participate after being selected, then that means that we're going to reselect another like women to replace that 20% and men to replace that 10%. Right? So you can quickly understand if we just eliminated those 30% and reselected another 30%, that it would create a difference between men and women, because more women, in this example might not be the case, it might be the opposite, obviously, would or have desisted themselves, right? This issue becomes much more of an issue for, or as much of an issue perhaps, for other stratification criteria. For example, if you should stratify, in my opinion, based on income, right? To make sure that the poorer sections of society are represented, because they might be much more prone to desist themselves, right? And that the or poor, like less materially fortunate or less materially oriented, perhaps, people, right? And that the middle class is well represented, and that the upper class is obviously represented for what it's worth demographically, which is not much, right? Because the very rich people, let's say the top 10% would have 10% of the seats in this assembly, instead of having, nearly 100% in the U.S. Senate, right? Just a little punch on the Senate there, but while I'm at it, but the idea is that if you don't stratify, right, if you don't use that tool of stratification, you'll lose the representativity of the assembly, won't be as good, right? And so the other maybe two criteria you want to use are regional or provincial, or maybe urban and rural also, and basically based on territory, and based perhaps on ethnicity, right? Or at least in some cases take into account the, for example, in Canada, I'd be, I think it would be reasonable to make sure that there are some Indigenous people within the assembly, right? Proportional to their demographic proportion, right? In case like more Indigenous people would tend to desist, that way we'd be sure that there's enough Indigenous people to kind of represent those interests, right? And you could also stratify on other ethnic groups. However, because there's many, would become kind of a large issue. So you might want to simplify, or, depends. So basically, I'm not saying that's not an important issue also. I'm just saying you have to decide what criteria are the most important, right? I'd say economic and territorial, right? Other people would probably insist on gender and ethnic, but like, how could I say? The economic one probably has more impact, right? And the territorial one has to be there for so everybody's kind of represented. But I'm not saying the other ones aren't important, but I'm just saying that I would insist on those two and the other two also. But make sure those two are there, because they're probably more important than the other more popular ones in the public discourses that we have. And so I'm hoping nobody is offended by my priorities, but it's basically because often we don't stratify based on economics, right? We stratify based on those other criteria, and so what's going to happen is that you're gonna lose the representation of basically people that have a bit less interest in making money, or that happen to have less money, or that happen to come from environments where there's less money circulating around, basically. Okay, then there's another thing that has to be taken into account, at least here on a theoretical sense. I'm not going to probably use this for the examples of types of assemblies we could use for Palestine, but technically, you can randomly pick citizens, right? And that's what I've been talking about since the beginning of this presentation. You could call that pure selection, right? in the sense that you're selecting based on the criteria of being a citizen. There are minor issues there that I can mention, right? It's just to explain kind of how complex this can be also, and like what questions you have to ask and what decisions will impact a little bit how the assembly is going to work. These aren't like necessarily all. There are varying importance in the sense that some of these issues are more important than others, right? But okay, for example, even if you're just selecting pure, right, there's questions that you have to ask. For example, what happens if you select a prisoner, right? What happens? How do you make sure, or would you bother? Maybe not. Maybe you should. I think you should bother selecting or including homeless people that aren't on the citizens list, right? Or, for example, home-free people that maybe also not aren't on that citizens list, although they might be home-free. I mean, people that, let's say, decide to live in their vans and travel, right? They might have an address there, but be in some other country or be in another province, and they might be harder to reach than certain people that might receive a piece of mail at their house, for example. So how do you make sure you include those people? And there's other groups, obviously, that you want to make sure that you include also. But even if you're selecting pure citizens, in a sense, not pure that meaning that they're pure but if the form of random selection is just citizens, right? That's what I mean by pure in this sense. There's these kind of like little group that you have to work to make it better, right? To be honest, even if you didn't include them, and this might sound like that's kind of to give you an example of what the importance of this is. Even if you didn't have the resources, let's say, to do it, right? Let's say you're selecting 30 people in Newfoundland, and you can't resource-wise really make sure that all the homeless people in this province are represented. It would obviously not be the best, right? But it would be a lot better than your forbid me for like, well, I won't say it. I'll be polite, but for the other assemblies that are not randomly selected, right? These assemblies would be much more representative of what the population is in any case, right? And so there are issues of fine tuning, but you also have to understand that depending on how much resources you have, in some cases it might be worthwhile emphasizing that or not as much, right? Now, there is an issue here that's kind of interesting, though, and I'll make a short parenthesis on this, although it might be better to send to another complete presentation. But there's the issue actually of children. I'll just mention it like quickly, right? Like in my view, when you're randomly picking, and this poses a sort of organizational challenge, when you're randomly picking citizens, children should be included, right? However, if a child is picked, let's say a minor citizen, right? Like, so below 18 years old, that citizen should be represented. Well, there's two options here, but let's say first, like a general rule, should be represented by one of their two legal representatives. So let's say I'm a kid, right? I'm kind of immature sometimes. So let's say I'm 12 years old and mommy and daddy here, I happen to be picked, right? And so one of my parents has to represent me. So you basically use a random selection method, like flipping a coin perhaps, to determine which one of the parents will represent the poor child here that can't, 12, maybe I could, but probably doesn't really want to, or might not have all the skills to represent themselves in the front of the assembly, right? Or within the assembly. And so you'd select one of the parents. Let's say the kid happened to be 6-year-old, then it would be more obvious, right? Now, there's a situation where if the minor citizen is, let's say, between 14 and 18, it's very obvious. If they're 12ish, the question could be asked, right? Maybe a few 12-year-olds that could have their place within that assembly. Let's give him that, right? That could self-represent, right? So basically what I'm saying is that the parent that's selected could also be given the power to decide if they deem their child to be capable of representing themselves, right? Maybe if the child's not willing, then it kind of resolves that issue, but or the minor citizen rather. But if that person, that younger person, wants to represent themselves, and if their parent or parents think that they could or should, then you just give them a go and they could represent themselves. And you could even have an in between. Like I mentioned, sometimes I behave like somewhat of a 12-year-old. Might not be the best thing to say in public, but I like to play and create and do stuff. So I'm kind of like, I might look a little bit childish when I'm doing that type of thing. But the for me, it keeps my brain a little bit like maybe younger. The let's say you have a 12-year-old, right? Why not bring the 12-year-old to the assembly with a parent, and they can see if they agree on everything, and they can decide which one decides if there's a conflict or a difference of opinion between the two, right? So let's say I'm the 12-year-old and I have my mommy here, right? That's besides me, and we're talking about this issue, and I'm like, let's do this or let's do that. We could both express our views, right? But when time comes to vote, if we had a difference of opinion there, maybe either the mother could decide that she'll keep that right for herself, or say, I'm there kind of to advise my child, but at the end of the day, that the child's been picked, and so whatever he decides, I'll let it go, right? It doesn't have such an impact anyways if that person is, let's say, 1 out of 300, right? If they're 1 out of 30, it has a little bit more impact, but it's still, I believe, manageable within an assembly like that. So now, obviously, that you'd have to make sure that whatever age a person is, that they can kind of or want to be there. And so that's just to give an idea about, even if you're just randomly selecting citizens, which is pure random selection in my jargon, there are still issues like that add or can add a layer of complexity. So there is pure random selection, but there's also, if you forgive me the expression, and it's not one I necessarily use, but the forms that aren't pure. And what I mean by forms that aren't pure is that you could also select people based on a particular criteria, right? Some of those criteria, it has to, you determine that, you'd fix that criteria based on the objective of that assembly. For example, if you wanted to have an assembly that represents the rights of nature, right, that represents essentially all the living organisms on the planet that also share the planet with us, and that should have a right to a clean environment, right? To have no pollutants in their water, to have the water they drink or the water they live in, to have clean forests, to have clean savannas, to have clean air also, right? And to exist. Sometimes we just like destroy them, right? Because by destroying their environment. And if you want to represent all those rights, right, you could not obviously select animals to participate in an assembly, right? You could maybe have a sort of a child's book about that subject. It would be kind of fun to do, actually, but for those that are interested. But instead of having like the Animal Farm of Orwell, you could have the Animal Assembly, Flitvak. Well, I won't write it, but the author can maybe reference to the idea if they want to. But they don't really have to. But the idea here is that obviously animals can't represent themselves. Other forms of life also can't represent their interests, in the sense that plants could technically be represented too. Now, however, within our species, right, there are people that may be better fit to represent their ecosystems. This is a parenthesis, but it kind of gives you an example of how far these types of ideas can go. You can take it with a grain of salt if you want, right? But there are people, as I said, that are maybe better fit to represent the interests of the ecosystem, right? And I could give you a few examples. I don't want you to sort of quote me on this, in the sense that I'm conscious of the fact that what I'll tell you here is probably like an initial idea that has to be worked upon. But let's say biologists, ecologists, in the sense that people that studied ecology, climatologists, are people that have knowledge that's particularly interesting for representing the rights of nature, right? Um, there's also other types of people, in the sense that if you well, I won't get into that for now, anyways, because it might create sort of it probably going a little bit too far for this presentation. But let's say you decided to represent those rights by people that were specialized in that field. Right? You could basically say, well, the requirement will be to have, let's say, a university degree or maybe a CJEP or college degree in a field that is of the life sciences, right? But more on the sort of on the animal part of the life sciences, or the non-human part rather, right? And so all biologists that are specialized in those on that side of biology, right? You'd have other like botanists or other types of animal psychologists and stuff like that. All those people could be in that pool, and we could randomly pick from that pool and say, well, you guys will represent the rights of nature, and that other assembly will represent the rights of or the interests of humanity, right? Not that those two things are dissociated, but they might be more skilled to represent those rights, for example, right? Um, I will mention that idea. I kind of told you I might not, so I'll contradict myself a bit here. Another way we could do this, for example, is to say it's a particular way, and it's kind of curious when you first hear about it, because it kind of like it makes you realize how our political systems are skewed in a sense, right? Is that if we didn't want to select specialists based on their education, we could say we'll just select citizens, but we'll select them based on the ecosystem. So what that would mean, it would be kind of interesting for a number of people, let's say the indigenous people that still live in areas that are less populated, right? If you represent the ecosystems, and you'd have to obviously, like, they would become kind of the writings, right? What that would mean is that, let's say, if you take Quebec, for example, as an example, the people of Montreal would have maybe one representative, but the people living in the north would also have, might, like, let's say in an area that's not very populated, might have 12, right, or 10 or 5, right? And depends how the ridings are organized, because Montreal is basically a very tiny ecosystem, and the other city of Quebec is also a very tiny ecosystem. They're important, but they have to, I mean, they're there, right? But ecosystem wise, they don't represent much of that whole territory, right? So what that would mean is that those citizens would be highly regional, right? And being from those ecosystems, or participating or being within those ecosystems, the argument here is that they'd be more fit to represent the interest of those ecosystems. Because if you don't do that and you randomly pick citizens based on population, you'd have tons of people from Montreal. You forgive me if you're from Montreal yourself, or even if you are, don't forgive me, because it's just like it's a plain fact. Like, it's not because I'm myself from Quebec, but like if you just randomly pick based on human population, you'd have an over-representation of that tiny insignificant ecosystem compared to the immensity of Quebec as an ecosystem, right? And so you can see how those two modes of reasoning are different. So that's another form of impure random selection, in a sense, in that now you're using ecosystems as a basis, right? Although you're still selecting citizens, ecosystems kind of come into play. So what I'm saying here is that if you have a capacity to imagine stuff, you probably, listening to me, you can kind of imagine that there's different issues or different situations or different possibilities of how you can use a specific tool, right? Sorry, I'm not wearing my contacts on. I'm checking my notes to be sure I didn't miss much. So those are kind of the technical aspects I wanted to talk about. So this said, right, let's get back to let's apply this based on Mr. Tarasov's concern, which is obviously not just his own, but about the situation in Israel and Palestine as an example, right? But if you want to, like, imagine something, you could try to, address what the challenges would be to do such an assembly for Ukraine and Russia as well, because that's another conflict, and there's other conflicts in the world as well. But I'm using this one as a sort of potential groundbreaker, right? Because it died, it came from him, basically. And I find that's where I first got the idea of thinking about this. So, so first idea, right? Instead of using pure random selection, we could select based on, well, it's tricky in this case. I was going to say based on ethnicity, but not quite, somewhat. Let's say based on this ethnicity, but it's also based slightly on religion, right? In the way, at least I wrote it in my notes, right? So basically we could select half Jewish people, right? And half Palestinian Canadians. So half Jewish Canadians, half Palestinian Canadians, tell them to get together and give us a plan to tell our politicians what can be done in that situation, right? That would be kind of an interesting first take. That's actually the first idea I kind of have, but just by the way, when I was talking to Mr. Tarasov. But often when you're in a quick conversation like that, well, in my case, you go back home and you kind of think about it more and you come up with better ideas. But it is a challenging idea, right? To say, well, what would happen if we did that? And the mandate we could give these people is, what do you think we should do about that situation? And in the perspective of what do you think the Canadian policy should be on that particular situation, right? Obviously, right? You'll forgive me to use a bit of humor here, but sometimes laughing can maybe resolve, the hatred that comes with war. Obviously, if you had half Jewish people and half Palestinians in a room in Canada debating about that issue, you might need a few guards around to make sure there's no overspill, right? Because we don't necessarily want the violence that's there to be, we prefer avoiding it here, hopefully, right? For most people. But you can understand that it would be a heated debate for obvious reasons, right? Because those people are all linked to those two countries. And so they do have a sort of, or jurisdictions, you could say. And so they do, obviously, it comes and gets them a lot more, right, than other people. Now, it's not that, it's obviously not that other people aren't linked to those people, but, when your family is there, or your friends are there, or, your past is there, you do obviously kind of look at these things differently, and you do know, like, the garbage that's around, I could say, because there's a lot of crap involved in it, like a political thing that's out there, and you do understand the complexity and the knots, you could say, that are existing in that situation. You do know what the hatred is because you've been there, and maybe you even have those emotions yourself, right? So some people might question, what is there wisdom in putting people like that together in a room to debate? I think it would be an interesting experiment, at least, right? I do have other proposals if you want to have an assembly that doesn't have as many security guards, but you'd still probably need a few. So that was a first take, and it gives you an idea about, this take upon take, as I'll go on, will give you an idea about, how this is a fascinating subject, because you can be very creative in imagining different ways in which you could use this tool of random selection in politics. So, second idea is that we could also have a pure randomly selected assembly of I'll say it with a bit of humor here, normal Canadians. Not that our brothers and sisters on both sides aren't normal, but regular Canadians that might be a few Jewish people and a few Palestinian people, but just purely randomly selected Canadians, right? And so in that assembly, you'd have hopefully a lot of peacemakers and two groups that would probably be pretty much need to have their specific assigned security guards to make sure it won't get overheated, right? Too much. Because it's okay to express, feelings that are hard, but when it comes to using physical means to harm other people, that's when it becomes a problem. I mean, the emotions themselves are actually the problem, like initially, but the obviously the actions that come out of that are more dangerous, right? And so what I'm saying here is that you could have, let's say, 300 randomly selected Canadians, one from each jurisdiction. There might be a little bit more than 300. Because the number of MPs tends to grow, and these people could basically be given the mandate to forge the Canadian policy on that issue. Now, there's a question. There's a question on what question those people would have to answer. Right? I'll get to that eventually, but for the moment, let's stick with that idea of them doing the Canadian policy on our state policy on that issue. Now, a third idea, right? Actually, before getting to the third, I'll develop this one here because I think that one is pretty much the one I'd select now, right? Nothing against the idea of putting half Jews and half Palestinians in a room, but maybe it would be a little bit overheated. It would be interesting, though, and it would be symbolically meaningful to see what would happen there if they could come to sort of debate resolution of what has to be done, right? But if they forgive me for saying so, I think I'll trust the purely random selection Canadians a little bit more, right? Although we could maybe even try both, right? We could have like a small assembly of 25 and a bigger assembly of 300, right? So both ideas could technically, depending on financing, could coexist. But concerning this idea of 300 roughly speaking Canadian citizens, here's one twist we could do with, right? And this is more on the organizational side, but it kind of will give you an idea of like these issues. If we took 300 randomly picked citizens and flew all of them to Ottawa or to some other place, right, and had them debate about this issue, as you can imagine, it's going to become quite quickly costly, right? So if you crowdfund this, although Canadian citizens, I'm sure, are fairly generous, the cost of this experiment would be kind of high. So here's an alternative of how we could organize this. Let's say we randomly picked 300 Canadian citizens and we, roughly speaking, split the country in, let's say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 parts, right? So those 6 parts, you'll have to excuse me here from, well, let's say 7, right? I was going to say excluding Yukon and the Northwest Territories and those other northern territories. We could put them in a smaller, 7 jurisdiction. So basically you could have like BC, Alberta, could maybe put Saskatchewan and Manitoba together if they don't mind, Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes together if they don't mind, and Yukon and Northwest Territories and the Nunavut and other territories. I might miss a few because I'm not necessarily always looking at the map of Canada. Sometimes it changes for little things. We could have like one riding there too. And each one of those groups or regional groups would it would be proportional to their populations, right? But they would, so we'd have 300 people in all, but within those 7 groups, right? So once in a while, well, we kind of have 2 levels of debate. You'd have basically the regional debates on the issues, and they could be like, put online and organized in a manner for the other groups to be able to see what the other citizens are talking about, obviously. But cost-wise, it'd be a bit cheaper. To give this like quick example, if the people in BC grouped up in one location and debated together, let's say for a while, and than to fly all the 300 of them down to Ottawa or somewhere else to debate for a while, right? Because just of the distance and a lot of people being in Vancouver, these people wouldn't have to fly out, right? And wouldn't have to be lodged, and there would be less expenses. And so you'd have like these 7 assemblies, and on occasion, like in the process of debate, you would have 50 people out of the 30 that would fly to one of those 6 main locations. I hope that people from the Nunavut and from the Yukon and from the Northwest Territories can forgive me for suggesting that maybe we should stick with the bigger locations for grouping up. But it's basically just for the example in any case, in the sense that it might be cheaper to fly to those locations, but also a bit like warmer for people that aren't used to too much cold. Although personally, I'd be the one that wants to go up north, but check it out. But like practically wise, right, it might be better to stick to those 6 other locations. So if we had like once in a while 50 people from those randomly picked from those 300 would group up in St. John's, Newfoundland, then in Winnipeg, then in Vancouver, then in Toronto, then in Quebec City, then in maybe the Yukon if if we go against my crazy ideas of not having a trip up there too, right? And they would therefore kind of be a microcosm of the 300, and they would represent their various groups. They wouldn't represent their own particular ideas, but they would represent their various groups and try to put it all together and forward a final proposal, right? So that would be kind of the assembly of the assembly. And if we want to have them meet up more than once, well, we can have them meet up in different locations, and we can also select the first 50, and then there would be other groups of 50 that would kind of represent their writings as you go on. I don't know if you kind of get the picture of what I'm saying. It might be a little bit on the complex side for this presentation, but this is just to say that there are ways to that you have to take finance into account, right? There would be maybe a simpler way of doing this, is that if we could, simpler but not perfect in my opinion, if we could randomly pick 300 people and have them debate online, we could have that would be part of the debates, right? But at one point, there's things that are best done if you're with people and face to face, right? So if you have those moments where 50 representing the 300 come together, right, and do craft a proposal, it's easier to do that when you're face to face, right? And let's say at the end of all this, you could maybe have a quick weekend where everybody comes up, like all 300 come up to one location, and then they do finally adopt in person that proposal that came out from those multiple debates. So however you organize it, and as you can see, I'm a bit disorganized in my explanation of how it can be organized. There's ways, as I said, that you can kind of slide down on the expenses to make this affordable for a crowdfunding experiment, right? Or more affordable. Doesn't mean it's going to be cheap though, but it means it would be more affordable. And so my point here is basically that it's good to have online debate. It's good to have a larger debate at least at the end, but it might be practical in a very big country to split up the debates and to kind of have a mingling of electronics and face-to-face meetings where these discussions can happen, right? So it's kind of a long way to say that it doesn't necessarily mean having people for 3 months in Ottawa debating this subject, which would cost a lot of money for a crowd-funded subject. Now, this is kind of my idea for what a Canadian assembly could look like, but let's see what the impact of that could be. It could lead to an interesting, how could you call it? It could lead other countries basically to kind of follow suit, right? I'm thinking of Europe here, but I'm also thinking of our neighbors that do have the same issue, but that also do have much more power and that do have a relationship with Israel that puts them in a position where the decisions that they'll take will probably have more impact, unfortunately, than the decisions that us Canadians will take on at the end of the day, right? But as Canadians, and I'll dare say as enlightened Canadians in some cases, that's kind of a joke on our neighbors. We're not always enlightened, fortunately, and numerous of our neighbors are, hopefully. I would like to suggest that maybe it would be easier to start it as a Canadian experiment and to see if our American brothers and sisters don't want to follow suit. Let them decide that, but it would give them an example of how things could be done in a manner that's a bit less confrontational than what's probably going to happen if we look at how things have happened in the past in that country for these types of debates, right? Because it's kind of a polarized country in a sense, right? And this would give an opportunity to have a real talk on what's the problem there, because a lot of people look at it from far, right? And this is one of the main issues I should have probably talked about before, is that when you have an assembly like this, even though these are 300 randomly selected citizens, they're going to become specialists on this issue, because they're going to have a lot of people coming and telling them this is what the problem is, this is what should be done, this is their fault and their fault and their fault and this, that. And there's going to be a lot of different perspectives, and they're going to have to understand the history of those two nations and to understand the reality of those two nations. and they're going to be fed a lot more debate than what the media is feeding them at the moment, because the media is always biased. Whatever media you read, they're always taking a side, and the best they can do is take a side and kind of like tell us a little bit about what the other ones are telling too. But it's it's a very divisive issue, and so honestly, in my opinion, you can't really trust what the media are telling you, right? I mean, they're probably telling you basically, let's maybe pass upon that. But since I started talking about it, I'll have a quick comment at least. Basically, what they're giving you are is a partial truth, right? Some will talk about the Israelis that died and kind of not mention that there's 10, 13,000 Palestinians that died and that 40% of those are children, right? Some will mention that 30,000 Palestinians have died and that 40% of those are children, and kind of brush aside the fact that 1,400 or 2,000 or however many Israelis have died or been captured, as if that doesn't matter, right? If those numbers matter on one side, but they don't matter on the other side. And so they'll kind of like insinuate it's not really important if Palestinians die, but it is if Israelis die, or insinuate, all these Palestinians have died and nobody's talking about it, and but not really, mention or understand that there's also, violence or victims on the other side too, right? And that's just one little tiny aspect of it. But the big question isn't really, well, there is a question of what's the reality of what's happening there, but there's also a question of um, what's to be done, right? And that's the real question that has to be asked, because fault finding has its limits. Let's put it that way. It's not gonna allow you to resolve the conflict in a constructive manner, right? At the end of the day, the real question is what should be done, right? And so Canada or another country could, following suit with this idea, could lead by example, and by creating such an assembly, perhaps have one of the bigger nations that are more powerful and more influential follow suit and attempt this at home also. Right? Now, we could also go a step further, right? And this would kind of open up on that subject I initially talked about in this presentation when I was discussing Mr. Tarasov's idea, because his first question was, how could this be used on an international level, right? And so what would happen if, instead of selecting people to determine the policy of Canada or United States or Europe or any other nation, right, we'd randomly pick, I don't know, X, let's say 1,000 citizens from the world, and we would group them somewhere, right? And or have them communicate, like, and on a national level, and then have groups of them group up together, and like however you organize that, depending on how much financing you have, basically have them deliberate electronically or in person, and in person most probably, and then come up with a proposal of what they think is a path to peace for that part of the world, right? As an example, right? Because that's the other ripple effect of this idea, is that you can obviously understand that an experiment like this might be interesting from some other locations in the world, right? I don't have to name them, I suppose, or at least the most obvious one, right, which is Ukraine and Russia. But it could also be used in various situations that draw less media attention, right? And so it could be a sort of pacifier of the world by circumventing elected politicians or non-elected politicians in some countries, and having the people themselves look at these situations and tell us what do you think it should, what they think it should should be done, right? And let's say if you did that just as a thought experiment on the word level. I do understand that Mr. Tarasov and I are two dudes in two people in St. John's, Newfoundland, right? It's not as if we're in the most powerful, let's say, provincial state in the world, a provincial, government in the world. And so it sounds maybe a little bit grandiose to imagine that on the world level, but if we manage to do that, or if some people grouped up and managed to do that, the the interesting, well, it'll be a very beautiful thing to see, right? But the interesting effect of that is that, or the question that we'd have to ask ourselves is, what the hell will the politicians have to say regarding that proposal, right? Because basically it's kind of like, this is what the world population thinks should be done in that situation. So if the Canadian government, the American government, the Russian government comes and tells us we don't agree with that, well, I'm sorry, but a lot of your citizens do, and maybe most of them, and we do have a situation here where that assembly represents humanity in essence, right? It doesn't represent governments like the UN. It doesn't represent this nation or that nation. It doesn't represent only the rich people that are elected because they have enough money to run for office, or enough prestige or status, or etc. It represents the people of the world, right? So what I'm trying to say is that the legitimacy, of that assembly would in itself imply almost necessarily that it would have some impact somewhere, right? Even if nobody, the worst case scenario, if nobody decided to follow the advice of that assembly, right? Just as an experiment, it would kind of open up the door to, could this process also be used to address climate change in the world? Could this process also be used to address, let's say, the other conflict in the world, right? Could it be used on an ad hoc level, or even on a permanent level, to change the UN, right? Or maybe we could have an assembly like that and tell them, well, this UN isn't really functioning well. What do you guys think? How do you think we should organize our world institutions, right? And so we can have a sort of constitutional assembly of the world citizens that would be there to craft new world institutions that do function. It's nothing against the UN. They're probably doing the best they can, hopefully, but it just doesn't work. Let's face it. There's a lot of issues where I think they themselves can recognize that it's not enough, right? And I'm sure that a lot of them could find work in those better institutions afterwards anyways, right? So as workers there, obviously, I don't think they'd have to be threatened by the idea of having a debate on the dysfunction of the United Nations. It's not as if it's their fault. It's really the fault of these nations that can't let go of their power and weapons and control, and are harming the rest of the world because of that, in various locations and in various ways, right? We could talk about, let's say, Venezuela also. What's happening in Venezuela has kind of been ignored by our media, or like mentioned and blamed on the government there, but I'm not sure that government is fully to blame for the actions and policies of some other nations, of which I'm part, right? Unfortunately, or well, maybe fortunately, that have taken some policies on that nation. So there's another example of how this could be used to craft foreign policies that are in accordance with what the people themselves want, and not necessarily of what the oligarchs and the people funding the present day governments do want. So this said, I will thank you for listening to me if you have, because I was not expecting to do a presentation nearing an hour 20 minutes. But if you think there's something pertinent in what I said, or that this idea could be used, I'd invite you to share it, because I myself am not too bad in this subject, but I'm very lousy at electronics that I don't like. I'm not very good with computers. So if you do, find something in this presentation that's pertinent, share it and discuss it, and do something about it. So that's kind of the spark. And if you do have comments also, I'd be more than welcome to listen to them, and to, especially if you have ideas about how this something that could be bettered, you can obviously try to reach me and to send them to me. So do take care, and fortunately, or hopefully rather, with such ideas, we can maybe one day have a world where, let's put it this way, our children don't see too much violence on the news, right?